Welcome to Dr. Harmony. Life has a way of stripping us down to our barest elements when we least expect it. We spend decades building a fortress of security, only to realize we left the gates wide open for the person we trusted most. Today's story is a chilling reminder that sometimes the greatest enemy isn't the competitor in the boardroom or the stranger on the street, but the person sleeping right next to you. This is a story of wealth, a devastating betrayal, and a man named Arthur who learned that even the most golden retirement can turn into a leaden cage. Stay with us as we uncover how 40 years of devotion were dismantled in just 3 years of silence and shows. This is a journey through the ruins of a marriage that wasn't just broken, it was hollowed out from the inside. The rain in Chicago never felt as cold as it did that Tuesday evening. Arthur sat by the window of their high-rise apartment, watching the blurred lights of the city flicker like dying embers. For 40 years he had been the provider, the rock, the man who turned a small startup into a multi-million-dollar exit. 10 years ago, he thought he had won the game. At 55, he looked at his bank balance, then at his wife Eleanor, and decided that enough was enough. He had earned his rest. He wanted to be the husband who was actually present, the father who didn't miss another anniversary because of a closing deal in Dubai. He retired with a fortune that should have outlived them both by 2 lifetimes. He wanted to spend his days gardening, reading, and finally enjoying the quiet luxury of a life well lived. But as he sat there, the silence in the apartment was deafening. Eleanor wasn't home. She was rarely home anymore. When she did return, usually as the sun was beginning to creep over the Lake Michigan horizon, she didn't bring love or warmth. She brought a cold, sharpened tongue. Arthur remembered the exact moment the mask slipped. It was 6 months ago when he had suggested they tighten the budget slightly, because he noticed a strange dip in their primary investment account. Eleanor had laughed, a harsh, jagged sound that he didn't recognize. She had looked at him with eyes that were once filled with admiration, now replaced by a chilling disdain. "You are the most pathetic failure of a husband I have ever known," she had spat, the words hitting him harder than any market crash ever could. "My friends have husbands who are still out there, conquering the world, building empires, being men. And what are you? You're just a parasite, a house pet. You sit here in your slippers while I am the one actually living." Arthur had been stunned. He reminded her that the very walls she lived within, the designer clothes on her back, and the luxury SUV she drove were all paid for by his decades of grueling labor. But she didn't care about the past. In her mind, the man who provided was the man who was currently producing. The fact that he had retired to be with her was, in her eyes, a sign of weakness. What Arthur didn't know then, what he was only beginning to piece together through the wreckage of his bank statements, was that Eleanor had spent the last 3 years systematically bleeding him dry. While he was busy trying to be a good husband by handling the groceries and the housework to give her a break, she was frequenting the high-stakes underground casinos of the city's elite. The fortress Arthur had built was gone. The offshore accounts were empty. The emergency bonds had been liquidated. Eleanor hadn't just spent the money on handbags and jewelry. She had gambled it away on the thrill of the green felt table. Every time he had handed her a secondary card or signed a document she claimed was for tax purposes, he was signing away his life's work. She had drained millions. And now that the well was dry, she didn't see a partner. She saw a burden. She began working a low-level administrative job at a boutique firm, not because she had to support the family, but to have an excuse to be away from him, and to have a tiny stream of income that she refused to share. She would come home and mock him for not having a paycheck, conveniently forgetting that she had set fire to the mountain of gold he had given her. Arthur tried to fix it. He swallowed his pride and reached out to his old firm. He put on his best suit, one that felt a little looser now that the stress had stolen his appetite, and walked into the glass and steel towers of his youth. But the world had moved on. The recruiters looked at his age, then at the decade-long gap in his resume, and offered nothing but polite rejections. "The industry has changed, Arthur," they told him. "We need digital natives. We need the hungry 30-year-olds. He was a relic. He was a king without a kingdom, standing in the rain, realizing that the poverty he had outrun in his 20s had finally caught up to him in his 60s. He returned home to find Eleanor dressed for another night out, her eyes scanning him with a look of pure, unadulterated disgust. Eleanor didn't even look up from her vanity mirror as Arthur walked through the door. His shoulders slumped from the weight of another day of rejection. The scent of her expensive perfume, a scent he had once found intoxicating, now smelled like copper and decay. She was meticulously applying a deep red lipstick, her movements sharp and practiced. Through the reflection, she saw his disheveled state, his damp coat, and the exhaustion etched into the lines of his face. She let out a short, mocking puff of air. "Back so soon, Arthur? I assume the world still has no use for a man who spent the last decade playing gardener while his wife withered away in boredom." Her voice was a whip, cracking in the quiet of the room. Arthur sank onto the edge of the bed, the mattress he had bought with a bonus check 15 years ago. "I went to 3 agencies today, Eleanor. They told me I'm overqualified, which is just a polite way of saying I'm too old. I don't understand how we got here. I don't understand where it all went." He looked at her, pleading for a shred of the woman he had married in that small chapel in London all those years ago. But that woman was a ghost. The person in front of him was a stranger, wearing his wife's skin. She turned around, the lipstick bold and blood-colored. Where it went? It went to living, Arthur. It went to maintaining the status you promised me. Do you think I was going to sit in this tomb of an apartment and watch the paint dry just because you decided you were tired of working? She grabbed her designer clutch, a limited edition piece that cost more than most people's cars, and stood up. "You're pathetic. You sit there acting like a victim of a crime when the only crime is your laziness. I'm going out. Don't wait up and don't bother calling. My friends' husbands are hosting a gala tonight. Real men. Men who didn't give up." She slammed the door, the vibration rattling the framed photos on the hallway wall. One of them, a picture of them on their 30th anniversary in Paris, tilted and fell. The glass didn't shatter, but the crack across their smiling faces was symbolic enough. Left in the dark, Arthur finally did what he had been too afraid to do for months. He went to the small study and opened the bottom drawer of his desk. He pulled out the physical bank statements he had intercepted from the mail. He began to spread them out on the floor, a paper trail of his own destruction. He saw the withdrawals, 10,000 here, 50,000 there. He saw the wire transfers to entities with names like Emerald Horizon and Riverboat Ventures. These weren't investment firms. They were shell corporations for high-stakes gambling rings and private betting clubs. The deeper he dug, the more his stomach churned. He found a second mortgage on their vacation home in Aspen, a home he thought was paid off. He found credit cards he didn't even know existed, all maxed out to their limits. The numbers were staggering. It wasn't just that the money was gone. They were in the red. Deep, dark, suffocating red. Eleanor hadn't just spent his wealth. She had leveraged their future to fuel a frantic, desperate addiction to the rush of the win. And when the wins didn't come, she had simply doubled down with his blood, sweat, and tears. He realized then that her insults and her verbal abuse weren't just the result of a fading romance. They were a defense mechanism. By making him the failure, she didn't have to face her own treachery. By branding him a parasite, she justified her own parasitic behavior. She had spent 3 years gaslighting him into believing that he was the reason their lifestyle was crumbling, while she was the one holding the match. He felt a cold shiver run down his spine as he looked at a final notices for their property taxes. They were weeks away from losing everything. The next morning, Eleanor returned at 6 a.m., smelling of smoke and expensive gin. She found Arthur still sitting on the floor of the study, surrounded by the evidence of her betrayal. He didn't look up as she entered. "How could you do it, Eleanor? 40 years. We were supposed to grow old together. This money was for our grandchildren, for our peace. His voice was a hollow whisper. She didn't flinch. She didn't cry or beg for forgiveness. Instead, she laughed. It was a cold, hysterical sound that echoed in the small room. Your peace? Your peace was my prison, Arthur. You wanted to stay home and be comfortable. I wanted to feel alive. And if you weren't smart enough to keep an eye on your own wallet, that's your fault, isn't it? You're the one who retired. You're the one who stopped being a provider. If you want to talk about betrayal, talk about the man who promised me the world and then decided to spend his days in a bathrobe. She walked over and kicked a stack of bank statements, scattering them across the floor like autumn leaves. I'm going to sleep. When I wake up, I expect you to have found a way to pay the bills. After all, you're the great businessman, aren't you? Arthur watched her walk away, and for the first time in his life, he didn't feel anger. He didn't feel the urge to argue or fix the situation. He felt a profound, soul-deep emptiness. He realized that the woman he loved had never truly existed, or if she had been consumed by a greed he couldn't satisfy. He was 65 years old, bankrupt, and living with a predator. He looked at his hands that had built a legacy, and saw them shaking. He knew he couldn't stay. He knew that if he stayed, the remaining fragments of his spirit would be ground into the dirt until there was nothing left but a shell of a man. The city he once loved now felt like a concrete jungle designed to swallow him whole. The following weeks were a slow-motion descent into a living nightmare. Arthur tried to maintain a sense of order, but the walls of his life were closing in. Every ring of the telephone was a debt collector. Every knock at the door was a process server delivering another notice of a lawsuit or a lien. He had spent his entire life protecting his reputation, his credit, and his name. Now, he watched as Eleanor's reckless shadow darkened everything he had ever touched. He attempted to talk to her one last time, hoping that the gravity of their situation would finally break through her wall of denial. He found her in the kitchen, sipping an expensive espresso she had bought with the last few dollars of her paycheck, while the refrigerator behind her sat nearly empty. Eleanor, we are being evicted from the apartment in 30 days, Arthur said, his voice steady but fragile. The Aspen house is already gone. The bank seized it yesterday. We need to sell whatever jewelry you have left. The art, the furniture. We need to move into a small rental and figure out how to survive. He reached out to touch her hand, a habit born of 40 years of marriage, but she pulled away as if his skin were caustic. She looked at him with a sneer that distorted her features, making her look like a complete stranger. I am not selling anything, Arthur, she said, her voice dripping with venom. Those pieces are mine. They are the only things I have left of the life you failed to provide for me. If you're so worried about being evicted, why don't you go out and get a job? My friend Marcus's husband just landed a consulting gig at 62. But then again, Marcus's husband hasn't let his brain turn to mush like you have. She stood up, smoothing her skirt. I have a dinner meeting tonight with some potential investors for a new project. Don't be here when I get back. Your moping is draining the energy out of the room. The investors, Arthur knew, were likely just more victims, or perhaps the very people she owed money to, at the card tables. He realized then that she wasn't just a gambler. She was a delusional narcissist who had rewritten the history of their life to make him the villain. In her mind, he was the one who had stolen her youth by retiring, and the money she had spent was simply her compensation. There was no logic left to appeal to, no shared memory that could bridge the chasm between them. Arthur spent the afternoon in his study, the room that used to be his sanctuary. He looked at his awards, his old photographs, and the mahogany desk that had seen the birth of so many successful ventures. He realized that if he stayed, he would be forced to watch as the moving crews hauled his life away piece by piece. He would be forced to endure Eleanor's daily ritual of humiliation as they moved into a dingy, one-bedroom apartment in a part of the city he had spent 40 years trying to avoid. He saw his future. A man in his late 60s working a grueling minimum wage job just to pay for his wife's next hand of poker. He felt a strange, cold clarity wash over him. It was the same clarity he used to feel during high-stakes negotiations. The moment when you realize the deal is dead and it's time to walk away from the table. He didn't have much left, but he had his dignity, or at least the small spark of it that hadn't been extinguished by her insults. He began to pack a single suitcase. He didn't take the expensive suits or the gold watches. Those would be seized anyway. He took his sturdy hiking boots, a few sets of durable clothes, his old journals, and the small amount of cash he had managed to hide away in a hollowed-out book. A few $100s he had been saving for a rainy day. He realized it wasn't just raining. The dam had broken. As he packed, he came across a deed to a small, forgotten plot of land in the Appalachian foothills. He had bought it decades ago on a whim, thinking he might one day build a hunting cabin there. It was a rugged, isolated piece of earth, miles away from the nearest town. It was worthless to the banks and invisible to Eleanor's creditors, because it was held in a defunct trust he had created for his late father. It was the only thing she hadn't found, the only piece of the world that didn't have her fingerprints on it. He looked at the apartment one last time. The floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic view of the skyline he had helped build. He had been a king here, but as the sun began to set, casting long, bloody shadows across the hardwood floor, he realized that he was now just a ghost in his own home. He wrote a short note and left it on the kitchen island. It didn't contain any pleas for forgiveness or expressions of love. It simply said, "You told me I was a failure because I didn't provide enough. Now you can provide for yourself. The debt is yours, the silence is mine." He walked out of the door with his suitcase, not looking back. He took the elevator down to the lobby for the last time. The doorman, who had known him for 20 years, tipped his hat. "Going on a trip, Mr. Sterling?" Arthur paused, the weight of the suitcase feeling strangely light. "Yes, Henry, a long one. I'm finally going home." He stepped out into the cool evening air, the roar of the city sounding like a distant, fading memory. He didn't go to the garage for his car. That, too, would be repossessed by morning. He walked toward the bus station, a man with no destination but away. The bus ride toward the Appalachian foothills felt like a slow purging of Arthur's soul. With every mile that passed, the glittering lights of the Chicago skyline wooded, replaced by the jagged ink-black silhouettes of ancient trees. He watched his reflection in the window, a man who looked a decade older than he was, his eyes hollowed out by betrayal. He was leaving behind the lawsuits, the creditors, and the woman who had turned his 40 years of devotion into a punchline. For the first time in his life, Arthur Sterling had nothing, and in that nothingness, he found a terrifying kind of freedom. He stepped off the bus in a small, nameless town where the air tasted of pine and damp earth. From there, he began the long hike toward the coordinates on the old deed. His designer shoes, never meant for anything more rugged than a marble lobby, were ruined within the first hour. By the second hour, his feet were bleeding, but he didn't stop. He couldn't stop. The mountain was calling to him, a silent, stony judge that didn't care about his bank balance or his former titles. It was a climb toward a different kind of life, one where the only betrayal possible was a fire that wouldn't light or a roof that leaked. When he finally reached the plot of land, he found a scene of complete desolation. The cabin, he remembered, was little more than a collapsing shack, reclaimed by ivy and rot. The porch had buckled under the weight of decades of snow, and the windows were long gone, leaving the interior open to the whims of the wind. He stood in the center of the clearing, surrounded by the towering oak and hemlock trees, and let out a long, ragged breath. There was no running water. There was no electricity. There was no one to call him a failure. There was only the mountain and the silence. The first few days were a brutal lesson in humility. Arthur, a man who had once commanded boards of directors, struggled to gather enough dry wood for a fire. His hands, softened by years of office work and a decade of comfortable retirement, blistered and tore. He spent his first night shivering on the floor of the shack, wrapped in a thin blanket, listening to the mountain lions scream in the distance. Every muscle in his body ached with a dull, throbbing intensity. He thought of Eleanor, likely screaming at an empty apartment, wondering where her parasite had gone to hide the remaining scraps of his dignity. He felt a grim satisfaction knowing she was finally facing the consequences of her greed alone. Hunger became his constant companion. He had brought a small supply of dried goods, but he knew they wouldn't last. He had to learn to forage, to identify the berries and roots that wouldn't kill him, and to trap the small game that scurried through the underbrush. It was a desperate, primitive existence. One afternoon, while trying to clear a patch of land for a small garden, he collapsed from exhaustion. He lay there on the cold earth, looking up at the canopy of leaves, and for a moment, he wanted to stay down. He wanted to let the mountain take him, to let the forest floor bury the failure he had been told he was. But then, a memory flickered in his mind. Not a memory of his wealth or his success, but a memory of his grandfather, a man who had survived the Great Depression with nothing but a hammer and a stubborn will. He remembered the calloused hands of the men who had built the world before it became a world of digital numbers and paper lies. Arthur realized that Eleanor had stolen his money, his home, and his past, but she couldn't steal his capacity to endure. He forced himself to his feet, his fingers clawing into the dirt. He wasn't a failure because he was poor. He was a success because he was still breathing. He began to rebuild, one agonizing piece at a time. He used the rusted tools he found in the shed to patch the roof with scraps of tin and bark. He hauled stones from the nearby creek to create a hearth that wouldn't set the floor on fire. Every small victory, a fire that stayed lit through the night, a patch of roof that didn't leak during a storm, felt more significant than any million-dollar deal he had ever closed. He was no longer Arthur Sterling, the retired mogul. He was Arthur, the man of the mountain. As the weeks turned into months, the physical transformation was startling. The softness of his face hardened into lean, weathered angles. His eyes lost their haunted look, replaced by a sharp, predatory focus. He moved with a quiet efficiency, his body adapting to the demands of the wilderness. He discovered a deep, hidden spring of strength he never knew he possessed. In the city, he was an old man waiting to die. Here, he was a survivor, learning to live. He had traded the luxury of a penthouse for the majesty of the peaks, and for the first time in 10 years, the nightmares of Eleanor's voice began to fade into the rustle of the leaves. The seasons on the mountain were not merely markers of time. They were adversaries to be respected. As autumn bled into a harsh, unforgiving winter, Arthur found himself pushed to the absolute limit of human endurance. The mountain didn't care about his pedigree or his previous status. It only demanded competence. He spent his days hacking away at fallen timber, his movements rhythmic and steady. The constant physical labor had burned away the last traces of his former life. He was leaner now, his muscles corded like the roots of the ancient oaks that surrounded his shack. His beard grew thick and gray, a silver mane that mirrored the frost on the hemlock needles. One afternoon, while searching for a specific type of flint near a ridge he hadn't yet explored, Arthur stumbled upon something that shouldn't have been there. Tucked away beneath a jagged overhang of granite was a rusted iron door, nearly swallowed by the earth and creeping lichen. It looked like an old mining cache, or perhaps a survival shelter from a forgotten era. With a heavy branch used as a lever, he spent hours prying the door open, the screech of metal on metal echoing through the silent valley like a dying bird. When the door finally gave way, he found himself staring into a small, dry chamber carved into the heart of the mountain. Inside, there were no treasures of gold or silver, Instead, there were crates of old tools, jars of preserved seeds that had long since turned to dust, and a stack of leather-bound journals. As Arthur sat on the cold stone floor, flipping through the brittle pages, he realized he wasn't the first man to seek refuge here. The journals belonged to a man named Silas, who had fled the city during the industrial collapse of the previous century. Silas had written extensively about the poison of the crowd and the illusion of the ledger. He wrote about how men lose their souls when they define their worth by what they can buy rather than what they can build. Reading Silas's words, Arthur felt a profound sense of kinship. He realized that his failure in the eyes of Eleanor was actually his liberation. She had measured him by his utility, by how much gold he could pour into her hands. When the gold ran out, she saw him as a broken tool. But here, in the silence of the cave, Arthur saw himself for the first time as a complete human being. He wasn't a bank account. He wasn't a provider. He was a man capable of existing in harmony with the harshest elements of nature. He took the tools back to his cabin, treating them like sacred relics. They were symbols of a different kind of wealth, the wealth of self-reliance. With the new tools, his progress accelerated. He built a more permanent structure, a sturdy log cabin with a deep porch that looked out over the valley. He diverted a small stream to create a primitive irrigation system for the spring garden he was planning. He began to trade with the people in the town at the base of the mountain, not with money, for he had none, but with the intricate wood carvings he created during the long winter nights and the rare medicinal herbs he had learned to identify. The locals didn't know his name, and he didn't offer it. To them, he was simply the man of the ridge, a silent, dignified figure who appeared once a month with goods that were crafted with a precision they hadn't seen in years. Back in the city, the life he had left behind was a crumbling ruin. He often wondered, in the quiet moments before sleep, what had become of Eleanor. He imagined her sitting in a dark, cold apartment, the power cut off, the creditors finally knocking with the authority of the law. He wondered if she ever looked at the empty space on the bed and felt a flicker of regret, or if her heart was so encased in the ice of her own greed that she still blamed him for the silence. He realized that her greatest punishment wasn't the loss of the money. It was the fact that she was now left alone with the person she truly was. She had no one left to blame, no one to siphon from, no one to belittle, to make herself feel tall. Arthur found that he no longer carried the weight of her insults. They had become like the wind, audible, but unable to leave a mark on the stone. He had forgiven himself for retiring, and he had even, in a strange way, forgiven her for the betrayal. Her treachery had been the fire that forged his new life. If she hadn't destroyed him, he would have spent another 20 years in that glass cage, slowly dying in a bathrobe, watching her spend his life's blood until there was nothing left but a bitter end. The mountain had given him a second chance, a raw and beautiful rebirth that most men never get to experience. As the first thaw of spring began to melt the mountain snows, Arthur stood on his porch and watched the sunrise. The sky was a bruised purple, turning to a brilliant burning orange. He felt a deep, resonant peace. He was nearly 70 years old. He had no savings, no retirement plan, and no family who spoke his name. But as he inhaled the scent of damp pine and wood smoke, he knew he was the richest man he had ever known. He had conquered the only thing that truly mattered, his own fear. The spring thaw brought more than just the rushing waters of the creek. It brought a visitor. Arthur was behind his cabin, splitting logs with a rhythmic precision that had become his meditation, when he heard the unnatural crunch of tires on gravel far down the access trail. He froze, the axe held mid-air. No one came this far up. The locals stayed in the valley, and the world he left behind didn't know he existed. He watched as a dusty black SUV struggled up the final incline, its engine whining against the grade. It stopped 50 yards away, and for a long moment no one moved. A man stepped out. He was in his mid-40s, wearing a charcoal suit that looked absurdly out of place against the mud and the pines. It was Marcus, his former protege and the only man in the corporate world Arthur had ever truly trusted. Marcus looked around the clearing, his eyes landing on the rugged, bearded figure holding an axe. It took him several seconds to recognize the man who had once been the titan of Chicago's financial district. "Arthur?" Marcus asked, his voice cracking with a mixture of awe and disbelief. "Is that really you?" Arthur lowered the axe but didn't move toward him. "You're a long way from the boardroom, Marcus. How did you find me?" His voice was raspy from months of silence, sounding like the wind through the dry leaves. Marcus walked closer, stepping carefully around a patch of melting slush. "It wasn't easy. I spent a fortune on private investigators. I tracked the old trust you set up for your father. It was the only asset Eleanor's lawyers couldn't touch because it was legally invisible to her." Arthur leaned the axe against a stump and wiped his hands on his worn canvas trousers. "Why come all this way? I'm dead to that world, Marcus. I prefer it that way." Marcus stopped a few feet away, his expression turning somber. "I came because I thought you should know. It's over, Arthur. The empire is gone. The apartment was seized 2 months after you left. Eleanor, she tried to fight the banks. She tried to claim you had kidnapped the funds, but the paper trail of her gambling was too thick. They took everything, even the jewelry." Arthur felt a ghost of a chill, but it didn't penetrate his skin. "And where is she now?" he asked quietly. Marcus sighed, looking away at the sprawling valley below. "She's living in a state-assisted housing complex on the south side. She's working as a night shift clerk at a motel. I saw her last week, Arthur. She's a shadow. She spends her breaks asking people if they've seen you, claiming you're a billionaire hiding a secret hoard. No one believes her. She looks broken." Arthur processed the information. He expected to feel a surge of vindication, a moment of "I told you so." But instead he felt a profound sense of pity, the way one feels for a wounded animal that doesn't understand why it's hurting. "She did it to herself, Marcus. She set the fire and then complained about the smoke." Marcus nodded slowly. "I know, but that's not the only reason I'm here. Your old firm, the board, is in a panic. The digital natives they replaced you with crashed the fund. They lost 40% in a single quarter. They're begging for a consultant who actually understands market cycles. They're offering a package that would put you back on top within a year." Arthur looked at his calloused hands, then at the cabin he had built with those hands. He looked at the garden he was preparing, the seeds he had saved, and the silence of the trees that had kept him sane. He thought of the high-rise in Chicago, the recycled air of the office, the backstabbing and the hollow pursuit of more. He thought of Eleanor's voice, the way it used to fill his head with poison. Here, the only voices were the birds and the wind. Here, he was the master of his own time. "I'm not coming back," Arthur said, his voice firm and resonant. Marcus blinked, clearly shocked. "Arthur, we're talking about millions. You could live anywhere. You could buy a house in the south of France and never see a mountain again." Arthur smiled, a genuine, slow-growing expression that reached his eyes. "You don't understand, Marcus. I already have everything I need. I spend my days building things that last. I eat what I grow. I sleep when I'm tired. In the city, I was a failure because I stopped earning. Here, I am a success because I started living." Marcus looked at the cabin, then back at his former mentor. He saw the strength in Arthur's posture, the clarity in his gaze. He realized that the man standing before him wasn't a hermit hiding from the world. He was a man who had outgrown it. "She still hates you, you know," Marcus whispered. "She still blames you for everything." Arthur picked up his axe again. "Let her. Hate is a heavy burden to carry, Marcus. Tell her I hope she finds peace, but tell her never to look for me. I'm not the man she knew. That man died in the city. This man belongs to the mountain." The weeks following Marcus's visit were marked by a strange, unsettling atmospheric pressure. The mountain seemed to hold its breath. Arthur, now attuned to the subtle shifts in the wind and the behavior of the animals, watched as the birds fell silent and the deer retreated into the deeper, thicker brush of the high canyons. A storm was coming. Not the typical spring rain that fed his garden, but something primordial. By evening, the sky had turned a bruised, sickly shade of green, and the air grew thick with the scent of ozone and wet slate. When the storm hit, it was a physical assault. The wind howled through the gaps in the ridges, sounding like 1,000 tormented voices. Thunder shook the very foundation of the cabin Arthur had worked so hard to build. Rain lashed against the tin roof with such force that he could barely hear his own thoughts. He sat by his hearth, the fire flickering wildly as the draft fought to extinguish it. He felt the familiar pang of fear, the same fear he had felt when he saw his bank accounts emptied. But this time, it was different. This wasn't a man-made catastrophe. This was the earth asserting its dominance. In the middle of the night, a sound louder than the thunder tore through the air. A sickening, grinding crack. A massive, ancient oak, weakened by the saturated soil and the relentless wind, came crashing down. It missed the main cabin by inches, but the heavy branches smashed through his storage shed, the one where he kept his winter wood and the few tools he had salvaged from the cave. Arthur rushed out into the deluge, the freezing rain blinding him. He worked like a man possessed, trying to clear the debris, his muscles screaming against the cold. As he struggled with a heavy limb, his foot slipped on the slick mud, and he tumbled down the embankment toward the swollen creek. For a terrifying moment, he was airborne. Then he slammed into the icy water. The current was a raging beast, pulling him toward the jagged rocks downstream. He clawed at the bank, his fingers digging into the freezing muck. He thought of Eleanor's face, her mocking laughter echoing in his mind. A husband who only knows how to eat bum. A failure. The words acted like a jolt of adrenaline. He refused to let her be right. He refused to let the mountain be his grave after he had finally learned how to live. With a primal roar that was lost in the wind, Arthur surged upward, grabbing a thick root and hauling himself out of the churning water. He lay on the bank, gasping, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. He was soaked to the bone, shivering violently, and his home was damaged. In the old world, this would have been the end. He would have called for help, filed an insurance claim, and crumbled under the stress. But here, there was no one to call. There was only the choice to give up or to rebuild. He spent the rest of the night in a state of hyper-focus. He didn't focus on the cold or the pain in his side where he had hit a rock. He focused on the fire. He tended to it until the cabin was warm again. He stripped off his wet clothes and wrapped himself in the heavy wool blankets he had traded for in town. As the dawn finally broke, revealing a landscape of shattered branches and mudslides, Arthur stood on his porch. His garden was buried under silt, and his shed was a ruin of splinters. He looked at the destruction and felt a bizarre sense of calm. He realized that the storm had done what Eleanor had done. It had stripped away his progress, but it hadn't touched the man he had become. The failure would have looked at the ruined garden and wept. The success looked at the mud and saw the minerals that would make the soil richer for the next planting. He realized that his life was no longer about the destination or the accumulation of things. It was about the act of standing back up. He spent the next several days clearing the fallen oak. He used the wood to build an even stronger shed. He channeled the silt from the flood to terrace his garden beds. Every scar on his hands was a testament to his survival. He found that he didn't miss the city more after the disaster. He missed it less. The city offered a fake security that could be stolen by a signature or a bad bet. The mountain offered a harsh reality that could only be conquered by character. As he worked, he realized Marcus's offer of millions felt like an offer to return to a dream that had become a nightmare. He preferred the waking life of the mountain where the air was cold, the work was hard, but the soul was finally irrevocably free. Word of Arthur's survival had begun to trickle down the mountain like the meltwater of spring. Though he sought no fame, the merchants in the valley whispered about the silver lion of the ridge, the man who had walked away from a fortune to find his soul in the timber and stone. Arthur was unaware of his growing legend until the morning he found a young man sitting on the stump of the fallen oak near his cabin. The boy couldn't have been more than 25, wearing a tattered coat and carrying a look of such profound desolation that Arthur saw a reflection of his own ghost in the boy's eyes. "I heard you were the man who knew how to lose everything and still stand," the young man said, his voice trembling. His name was Ethan. He had been a rising star in a tech firm until a series of brutal betrayals and a family tragedy had left him bankrupt and broken. He had come to the mountain not to live, but to disappear. Arthur didn't offer him a lecture or a hand up. He simply handed him a second axe. "If you want to disappear, do it while you're useful," Arthur said gruffly. "The shed needs more timber." For the next month, the cabin became a sanctuary for two. Arthur taught Ethan the language of the mountain, how to listen to the silence, how to read the clouds, and how to find strength in the ache of a day's labor. He shared the wisdom he had gleaned from Silas's journals and from his own ruined life. He told Ethan about Eleanor, not with bitterness, but as a cautionary tale of what happens when you build your house on the shifting sands of someone else's approval. A man is only a failure when he agrees with the world's definition of him, Arthur told the boy over a meal of roasted root vegetables and wild game. "She called me a parasite because I stopped producing for her. I became a man when I started producing for myself." Ethan listened, and slowly the light returned to his eyes. He realized that his ruined life was merely a shedding of skin. Under Arthur's tutelage, the boy learned that wealth was a tool, but character was the hand that wielded it. One evening, Ethan asked, "Do you ever regret it? Not the money, but the 40 years you gave her?" Arthur looked into the fire, the flames dancing in his silver beard. "I regret that I didn't see the woman she was, but I don't regret the man I had to become to survive her. Without her betrayal, I would still be a prisoner in a silk suit." As Ethan's strength returned, so did his resolve. He realized he didn't belong on the mountain forever. He had a life to rebuild, but this time, he would build it on a foundation of granite, not ego. When it was time for Ethan to leave, he tried to offer Arthur a small gold ring, the last of his inheritance. Arthur pushed his hand away. "Keep it. Use it to start something real, something that doesn't rely on the whims of the market or the greed of a partner. That is the only way to be truly rich." Watching Ethan walk down the trail, Arthur felt a sense of completion he hadn't expected. He had spent his life building a company, but in 1 month, he had built a man. It was a legacy that no bank could seize and no gambling addiction could drain. He realized that his isolation wasn't a withdrawal from humanity, but a purification of it. He was no longer the man who had been cheated. He was the man who had been chosen by the mountain to carry a truth that the city had forgotten. The solitude returned, but it was no longer lonely. It was a rich, vibrant quiet. Arthur found himself spending more time at the stone ridge, where he had found Silas's journals. He began to write his own entries, adding to the leather-bound books. He wrote for the next traveler, the next failure, who might stumble upon the rusted iron door, looking for a place to die, and finding, instead, a reason to live. He wrote about the cold Chicago nights and the stinging insults of a woman who chose gold over grace. He wrote it all down so that his story wouldn't just be a tragedy, but a map for the lost. He was 71 now, and his body was a map of scars and hardened bone. He knew his time on the ridge would eventually come to an end, as all things do. But he was no longer afraid of the end. He had faced the worst the world could throw at him: poverty, betrayal, humiliation. And he had come out the other side as a king of a small wild kingdom. He looked at his hands, steady and strong, and knew that he had finally achieved the one thing his millions could never buy. He was enough. The letter arrived with the monthly supply runner from the valley, tucked inside a bundle of salt and grain. It was a thick, cream-colored envelope that looked violently out of place against the rough wooden table of the cabin. The handwriting was unmistakable, a sharp, elegant script that had once graced thousands of love notes and dinner invitations. It was Eleanor's hand. Arthur stared at it for a long time, the smell of the expensive paper fighting against the scent of wood smoke and pine. For a moment his heart hammered with an old, familiar rhythm, a ghost of the man who had once been desperate for her approval. He opened it with a steady hand. There were no insults this time, no mentions of his failure or his status as a parasite. The letter was a jagged plea stained with what looked like dried tears. She wrote from a cramped room in a building that smelled of bleach and despair. She described how the people she once called friends had vanished the moment the money did. She spoke of the cold, the hunger, and the crushing weight of her own mistakes. She confessed to the gambling, the lies, and the systematic destruction of his legacy. "I was sick, Arthur," she wrote. "I didn't see you. I only saw what you could give me. Now that I have nothing, I see everything. Please, I am old, I am alone, and I am dying in a world that has no mercy for a woman with no gold. Come back. Help me, if not for love, then for the 40 years we shared." Arthur walked to the edge of his porch, the letter trembling slightly in the mountain breeze. He looked out over the vast, indifferent peaks. 10 years ago, he would have dropped everything to save her. He would have sacrificed his last cent to see her smile. But that man, the Arthur who lived for her, had been buried under the silt of the great storm. He felt a deep, hollow ache for the woman she used to be, but he also recognized the toxic pull of her words. Even now, in her desperation, she was asking him to be the provider again, to be the one to fix a life she had shattered with her own hands. He spent the night in a silence so profound it felt like a physical weight. He thought of the 40 years. He thought of the laughter in London, the successes in New York, and the long, slow rot of their final decade. He realized that if he went back, he wouldn't be saving her. He would only be re-entering the cage. She didn't want him. She wanted the security he represented. She wanted the real man she had mocked him for not being, the man with the bottomless wallet. The next morning, Arthur sat at his small desk and took a piece of rough, yellowed paper. He didn't write a long response. He didn't offer her money, for he had none, and he didn't offer her a way out. He wrote, "Eleanor, I cannot return to a ghost. The man you knew is gone, and the world you miss was an illusion we both paid for. I have forgiven you, but forgiveness is not a debt clearance. It is a release. You told me I was a failure because I didn't provide enough. Perhaps this is your chance to provide for yourself, to find out who you are when there is nothing left to take. Seek the peace I found, but do not seek it in me. My life belongs to the mountain now." He sent the letter back with the runner. As the dust from the man's truck settled, Arthur felt the last chord of his old life snap. It wasn't a violent break, but a quiet, necessary parting. He realized that her suffering was the final stage of her own journey, a mirror of the one he had endured on the ridge. He couldn't do the work for her. He couldn't be her crutch any longer. To return would be to validate her belief that he was merely a tool for her convenience. He climbed to the highest point of the ridge that afternoon. The air was thin and crystal clear. He looked toward the horizon, where he knew the city lay shrouded in its own smog and noise. He felt no anger, no triumph, and no regret. He felt only the immense, terrifying beauty of the present moment. He had been a millionaire, a retiree, a failure, and a hermit, but as the sun began to dip below the peaks, casting a golden light over his rugged kingdom, He knew what he finally was. He was free. The letter from the city was the final test, the last siren song of a world that tried to define him by his utility. He had passed. He turned his back on the horizon and began the walk back to his home. The seasons continued to turn, but Arthur stopped counting them. His life was no longer measured by fiscal quarters or anniversaries, but by the migration of the hawks and the thickness of the winter ice. He had become a part of the mountain's own geography. The silver-haired man who lived above the clouds became a source of quiet hope for the people in the valley below. Occasionally, someone would make the trek up the winding path, not to ask for money, but to ask for a moment of his time, a piece of his perspective. He became a silent mentor to the broken, a living proof that there is life after the world decides you are finished. In his final years, Arthur spent most of his time in the cave of Silas, adding the final chapters to his own journals. He wrote about the ultimate wealth, the ability to sit in a room alone and be at peace with the man staring back in the mirror. He wrote about the fallacy of the self-made man, acknowledging that while he built his cabin with his own hands, he had been carved into shape by the very betrayal that was meant to destroy him. He realized that Eleanor hadn't been his ruin. She had been his unplanned architect. She had stripped away the marble and the gold to reveal the unbreakable stone beneath. One crisp autumn evening, as the maples turned a vibrant burning crimson, Arthur sat on his porch and watched the sunset. He felt a familiar tiredness in his bones, a gentle winding down of the clock. He wasn't afraid. He looked at his garden, now harvested and resting. He looked at his sturdy cabin, which would stand for decades after he was gone. And he looked at the journals all tucked safely away in the stone chamber. He had lived two lives, one as a titan of industry who was a slave to expectations, and one as a failure who was the master of his soul. He knew which one had been the true success. He closed his eyes, the sound of the wind through the hemlocks singing him a final, peaceful lullaby. He had started his journey as a man who lost everything, only to realize that the everything he lost was exactly what had been keeping him from finding himself. On this mountain, there were no more creditors, no more insults, and no more shadows. There was only the light of a life lived with integrity and the deep, eternal silence of the peaks. Arthur Sterling didn't die a bankrupt man. He died a man who had finally settled his account with the world, leaving behind a legacy of resilience that no amount of gold could ever buy. Thank you for joining us on this journey through the peaks and valleys of the human spirit here on Dr. Harmony. This story reminds us that our value is never defined by our bank balance, but by our strength to rebuild. If this story touched you, please subscribe to the channel, hit the notification bell, and share your thoughts in the comments below. Your support helps us bring more stories of resilience and truth to the world. Until next time, stay grounded and stay true to yourself.